"Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now," said the Apache woman without hesitation. The snow wasn't supposed to come this early, not this heavy, not in this part of the season. But there it was, covering the broken fences, the dead haystack, the boots of the cowboy standing beside his half-dead horse. Wind bit through his coat like it wasn't even stitched shut, and frost clung to the ends of his lashes. A pale sun pushed through a sky thick with clouds, doing little to warm the land or the heart. He had hoped for a quiet ride down south before the mountain paths froze entirely. Just a day more, maybe two, and he would have reached the canyon river where kind folks let strangers sleep under their porch awnings. But he had misjudged the signs, the wind's sharp turn, the silence of the birds, the smell of iron in the sky. Now he stood, miles from the next marker on his map, horse trembling, lips numb, and his pride even colder than his fingers. Then came the crunch of footsteps, bare feet on snow, light, but certain. He turned slowly. A woman stood across from him, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl stitched with old red threads. Her long black hair was streaked with snow. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. She didn't flinch at the sight of a stranger, didn't lower her gaze or ask his name. She looked at the blue of his lips, the tremble in his knee, and said calmly, "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now." He stared at her like she was a ghost or some fever dream, an Apache woman, alone in the hills, offering warmth without a second thought. He had been raised to believe kindness had a price, that people like her had no reason to offer help to people like him, that she would hate him on sight, or worse, fear him. But her voice held no fear, only a quiet authority, like she'd faced winters harder than this and lived to tell it. Still, he hesitated, not because he didn't want to accept, but because he didn't know how to accept something given without demand. He looked past her, to a cave tucked beneath a rock face, its mouth covered in brush and skins, smoke faintly rising from inside. A fire burned there, a chance. She turned, walked back toward it without waiting. He followed, slow at first, then with urgency. The wind howled louder behind them, but inside, all was quiet. Not safe, not yet, but warmer than where he'd been, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, the sky was pale and heavy with grey light, as if the storm had only paused to breathe. Smoke rose from the mouth of the cave, curling into the cold air like a quiet question. Inside, the cowboy sat near the fire, coat steamed dry, hands now steady but spirit unsettled. The woman moved in silence, her steps careful but firm, stirring a pot with something that smelled earthy and plain. She did not speak, neither did he. When the warmth in his bones returned, so did the weight of his own discomfort. He didn't know her name, hadn't offered his, didn't know if he should stay seated, if he should help, if he should thank her aloud, or just leave quietly. He wasn't used to silence that wasn't angry. He wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a ledger. The sound of distant voices outside broke the uneasy peace. Then came the footsteps, men, women, children. He followed the woman's glance toward the cave entrance. Shadows moved beyond the curtain of hides. Her people, Apache. One man called her name. It cut the air with concern. Then another. The hides were pulled aside, and the outside world rushed in. 4, maybe 5 of them entered. The cave grew smaller by the second. Eyes darted to the cowboy, still sitting near the fire. Some faces tightened. One boy whispered something sharp that made another snicker. An older woman clutched a basket to her chest and frowned hard, not at the cowboy, but at the one who had let him in. The cowboy stood slowly, adjusting his hat out of habit more than pride. His body tensed like he was ready for blame or maybe a shove. He could feel every eye carving a judgment into his back. He had walked through many towns and heard many names thrown at his kind: drifter, fool, rider without roots. But this silence was worse than name-calling. It was thick with questions no one asked out loud. The woman stood still beside the fire. She didn't defend him. She didn't explain. But she didn't flinch either. Her eyes moved from face to face calmly, like this wasn't the first time she'd stood between a stranger and the suspicion of her own people. Someone muttered in a low voice, another nodded. The cowboy heard the word danger once, then white man, then something about last time. He looked at the woman again, this time not with shock, but a quiet kind of apology. She met his eyes. For the first time since she had found him in the snow, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, a subtle shift in her shoulders. She was used to being strong, but not immune to being judged. He opened his mouth to say something, but words felt wrong here. He nodded instead, lightly, a gesture of both thanks and intent to leave. But just as he stepped toward the entrance, the old woman with the basket spoke softly. Her voice was lined with age and smoke. She asked a question in their tongue. The woman by the fire answered just as quietly. Whatever was said, the room stilled. No one stopped him, but no one told him to go either. He stayed by the fire. The judgment lingered, but no longer grew louder. The storm outside had passed. The one inside, not quite. They sat again, now in front of others. He on one side of the flames, she on the other. Not enemies, not yet friends. Just two people who had broken a rule no one had spoken, but everyone had felt. He hadn't said his name yet, but the firelight had already told half his story. His hands, though steady now, were scarred in small, jagged laces, not from war, but from years of building things that never lasted. He carried the scent of old tobacco, wet leather, and something lonelier still. At night, when the cave grew quiet and the others returned to their own shelters, he stayed seated long after the flames had shrunk low, watching embers like they were a memory he couldn't quite hold. His name was Eli. He'd ridden from Missouri to Montana to Wyoming, and back again, never settling, never staying. The last place he tried to belong had a woman with braids like silk and a boy who called him Pa, only when others were around. He had tried, Lord knows he had, planted things, fixed fences, shared stories at supper, like a man trying to prove he could hold on to something. But the earth was unforgiving. So was time. The woman died the winter after harvest failed. The boy left the year after that. Eli never blamed him. He left too, though his leaving looked slower. One ride at a time, until one day there was no one left who knew where he had started. In his coat pocket, he still carried a letter, folded so many times the ink had faded and the paper tore at the creases. It wasn't long, just a few lines from the boy, written on a Sunday in May. You ain't bad, you just ain't warm. Mama tried. I tried too. I hope you find someplace soft. Eli never replied, didn't know how. Now here he was, in a cave that didn't belong to him, on land that wasn't his, given shelter by a woman who didn't know his sins or his silences. And still, she had taken him in. No questions, no fear, just one sentence. Simple, direct, human. She too carried a quiet history in her movements. Her name, he would learn, was Naya. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice held stories buried under dirt and ash. She had lived here longer than most, raised by a grandfather who had survived the raids and still carved wooden toys for tea. He had children in the village. Her mother was gone. No one said how. Her father, some whispered he was a white soldier. Naya never confirmed it. What Eli noticed was this. She never sat with the women, never laughed with the girls. She was respected but held slightly apart. A thread in the cloth, but woven with different dye. Like someone who had learned to build her own peace in the quiet, because the noise of belonging had never welcomed her fully. And maybe that was why she had helped him. Not because he was lost, but because she knew what it meant to live on the edge of warmth, always watching others enjoy what you were never quite invited into. They shared no stories that night, no confessions, but in the way they both stared at the same corner of the cave wall, at the way her fingers hovered over the pot just a second too long, and how his thumb traced the crease of that folded letter in his pocket. It was clear. Two people. Two ghosts of people, really, carrying losses they never spoke of, and for the first time in years, sitting near someone who might understand without needing the words. The wind changed on the third morning. Eli had stepped outside the cave just as the sun broke over the ridge, its light dull and grey behind the thick clouds. The air had a strange taste to it, dry, sharp, wrong. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind had returned, this time hot and fast. He knew that smell. Not wood smoke, not storm. It was sagebrush and ash. Fire. He turned toward the valley where the winter grass lay brittle and gold. A dark smudge floated on the horizon, growing. Behind him, he heard Naya step out. She stopped at his side, followed his gaze, and did not speak. Within minutes, the others were alerted. The fire was no longer a whisper. It was a crawl, a hiss over the dry hills, licking its way toward the shelters and small livestock pens built near the tree line. There were no sirens here, no water towers, no neighbors riding in to help, just the people, the hills, and whatever strength they had in their arms and hearts. Men ran for buckets, though. Most knew there was little water that wasn't frozen. Children were gathered and rushed toward the creek beds. Panic stirred in waves. Eli looked around for direction, waiting for someone to shout orders, but it was Naya who moved first. She didn't panic. She didn't shout. She took off down the slope toward the edge of the settlement where the fire line was closest. Not with buckets, but with a wide branch in her hands, its green needles still alive. Eli followed without thinking. She reached the nearest pen just as the flames crested over the ridge. A handful of goats were still trapped inside, bleating in terror, their fence too close to the tinder-dry brush. She climbed the rail in one swift motion, snapped the latch with a stone, and waved the animals out. The heat was already pushing in. Eli could feel it now, on his neck, behind his teeth. He grabbed the back gate and kicked it open wider. The animals scattered, some running straight toward the hills, some confused and circling. The fire hissed louder. Someone called Naya's name, but she was already turning toward the second pen, the one with the two old mules too stubborn to move without a fight. The flames were just minutes away now. The smoke thickened, stealing breath. Eli ran ahead this time, opening the second gate while swatting at the rising sparks. One mule ran. The other stood stiff, eyes wide with terror. Naya didn't hesitate. She took her shawl, tossed it over the animal's eyes, and pressed her hand to its side. She whispered something. Eli couldn't hear the words, but the mule moved. They got it out just as the first flame touched the edge of the fence. Later, when the smoke had cleared and the fire had changed course, pulled by a turn in the wind, people gathered near the creek. Some had soot on their faces. Others carried blankets. Everyone looked toward Naya, not with confusion this time, but with something quieter, something heavier. Respect. No one had expected her to take charge. Not the old men, not the younger ones who had always seen her as different. But she had. With calm hands, shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, Eli leaned back against the cave wall, legs stretched out, hat resting beside him. The usual sounds filled the silence, wood crackling, wind whistling at the edges, a distant owl calling out. They had shared this silence for days now, but tonight it felt fuller, heavier, waiting. It was Naya who broke it. "Why were you riding alone in the snow?" Her voice was calm, not curious, not even accusing, just wondering. Eli didn't answer right away. He watched the flicker of firelight dance across the stones, then rubbed his thumb over the edge of his boot. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, as if unsure it belonged in such a quiet place. "I wasn't going anywhere, just away." She didn't press, just nodded once and waited. "My wife died 3 winters ago," he said after a pause. "Fever came fast. The doctor came late." Naya's hands stilled in her lap. "There was a boy. Hers, not mine. But I raised him like he was. He left when he was old enough. Didn't say much. Just packed and rode off. Can't blame him. There wasn't much left worth staying for. Still, Naya said nothing, but her stillness deepened, and that was answer enough. So he kept going, like the words had been building, and only now found a door open enough to slip through. I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to feel it, the hole, the failure, like maybe somewhere out there, something softer was waiting. But I kept finding more cold, more dust, more silence. He looked up then, eyes meeting hers. The firelight made her face look older, wiser, worn, but not weary. "And you?" he asked gently. "You always live alone like this?" Naya looked toward the cave entrance. Outside, the moon was rising slow over the hills, casting a pale silver glow on the snow. "This cave belonged to my grandfather," she said. "He raised me here, after my mother was gone." Eli didn't ask where her mother went. Something in Naya's voice said the loss had never fully left. "He used to say quiet things grow strong," she continued, "but he didn't tell me how lonely strong can feel." She let the silence stretch for a while, then added, "The others. They never said it, but I knew. I wasn't like them. Not fully. My father was white. Some say soldier, some say trader. I never met him, but his blood made me different. Enough to be noticed. Not enough to belong." Eli's jaw tightened. "I know that feeling," he said. "Too white in some places, not white enough in others. Always someone ready to remind you where you don't fit." They both laughed, but it wasn't from joy, more like a tired understanding. "I used to want to leave," Naya said. "Thought maybe there was a place where no one cared who made you, just who you were. But every time I got close to leaving, I'd think of him, my grandfather, sitting by this same fire, telling stories, smelling of smoke and sweet roots. And I'd stay." Eli looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't just a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands. She was someone who had chosen roots, even when they tangled, who had stayed, even when staying hurt. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he admitted. "I didn't plan to find this place, or you, but I'm tired of dust, of riding." Naya turned her gaze toward the flames. "You don't owe me an answer," she said softly, "and you don't need to stay. But if you're tired, you can rest here, for a while." A pause passed between them. Eli shifted closer to the fire, not touching her, but near enough that their shared heat made the air feel less lonely. "I don't know how to rest," he said quietly. "I've been moving so long, I forgot what stillness feels like." Naya looked over at him. Her eyes were soft, not pitying, just seeing. "Then let it come slowly." And for the first time in years, I didn't reach for the firewood, didn't reach for the saddlebag or his boots. He stayed right there beside the woman who had offered shelter without a second thought, beside the woman who didn't ask for anything but still gave space for everything. No big declarations, no promises, just warmth. And the slow, quiet beginning of something neither of them had expected. The days came gentler after that night. The snow melted in patches across the valley, revealing earth that was dry but willing. The sky no longer pressed down but opened wide, clear and pale, like a breath finally exhaled. Eli stayed, not because he was asked to, but because something inside him had quieted. He helped where he could, rebuilt the mule pen that had scorched in the fire, chopped wood for those too old to lift the axe. He spoke little, but his presence stopped feeling like a question. Even the children began to accept him, offering berries or small sticks as if he were a tree newly rooted in their landscape. One morning, as the frost thinned and the sun held longer in the sky, Naya brought out a torn piece of leather. She held it with both hands, turning it over as if deciding something. Then, without words, she handed it to Eli. It was a glove, his glove. the one he had lost that first night, soaked through and stiff with ice. But now it had been repaired, stitched carefully with sinew, patched at the palm with soft hide. Eli turned it over slowly. The leather was warm from her hands. He didn't speak, just nodded. Once. Deep. Later that evening, as they sat side by side outside the cave, watching the fire smoke curl into the cold air, Naya broke a flatbread in two and handed him the larger half. It was such a simple gesture, but he looked at it like it meant more than food. They ate in silence. Then, slowly, without turning to him, she said, "There's a fence down near the west slope." He looked over at her, waiting. "We could fix it," she said. "You and me." There was no urgency in her voice, no command, just the offer of shared work, shared time. Eli smiled softly. "I'd like that." And the next day, they did. With splintered hands and quiet laughter, with wood that bent and posts that leaned, but stood anyway. No one helped, no one interrupted. It was theirs. Not just the fence, but the space between them. They worked until the light dipped low, until the shadows stretched long across the ground and the last piece of wire curled around the final post. Then they stood back and looked at what they had done. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole. She handed him the leftover nails. He placed them gently in her palm, and their fingers touched not by accident this time. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind moved through the dry grass like a whisper. And somewhere between that broken glove, that shared bread, and the fence that now stood because they chose to build it together, something unspoken had taken root. A promise, without words. A home, without walls. A feeling that would stay long after the fire had faded. And as the stars blinked awake in the quiet sky above them, the cowboy stayed exactly where he was. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time, he didn't want to be anywhere else.